Emma had always thought babysitting was simple: watch the kids, maybe catch a movie. But as the storm raged outside and the house creaked under the wind, she began to feel the weight of something darker. The unsettling silence was broken by a call from an unknown number, the voice on the other end too calm, too familiar. "Are you sure everything is okay with the kids?" it asked. The warning came quietly: "You should check on the children." When Emma went to the kids' room, the door locked from the inside, and the only sound was a whisper: "He's watching us." Something was wrong. And it was watching her now, too. The rain had been falling steadily for hours, its rhythmic patter on the windows blending with the low hum of the refrigerator. Emma stood by the window, watching the streetlight flicker in the distance, her gaze drifting between the wet pavement and the creeping shadows inside the house. It was her first solo babysitting job, and she had been so excited about it earlier. An easy gig, she thought. Just take care of 2 kids for a few hours, maybe watch some Netflix, and get paid. Simple. But now, as the house seemed to stretch and groan in the wind, she felt a strange unease creeping up her spine. Maybe it was just the silence, the kind of silence that feels like it's pressing in on you, like it's waiting for something. She checked the time on her phone, 9:45 p.m. The parents had just left about 20 minutes ago for a dinner reservation, and Emma had already texted them to confirm everything was fine. The kids were asleep, and she was left to her thoughts, or so she thought. The house, a large, old colonial with creaky floorboards and long, narrow hallways, seemed to loom over her. The walls were covered in old portraits, their eyes following her as she moved through the rooms. She tried to shake off the feeling, reminding herself that this was just a normal babysitting job. She turned away from the window, but as she did, her phone vibrated in her pocket. She pulled it out quickly, expecting a text from the parents, something small, like a quick check-in. But it wasn't them. The number on the screen was unfamiliar, a random, unsaved contact. Without thinking much of it, she answered, "Hello." Emma's voice trembled slightly, more out of reflex than fear. The line was silent for a moment before a soft voice, calm and steady, answered. "Is everything all right with the kids?" the voice asked. Emma frowned, glancing toward the staircase where the 2 kids had been playing earlier. They had gone to bed an hour ago, tucked in with their favorite stuffed animals. "Yeah, everything's fine," she said, though the hairs on the back of her neck began to rise. It wasn't the question that unsettled her, it was the voice. It was just a little too smooth, a little too deliberate. "Are you sure?" the voice continued, its calmness starting to feel out of place. "Because they're not the ones you need to worry about." Emma froze. Her heart skipped a beat, and for a moment, she almost convinced herself that she had misheard the words. "Excuse me?" she asked, her voice shaky. There was no response for a beat, just the faint rustle of static on the line. And then, the voice whispered softly, "You should check on the children." The call ended abruptly, and Emma stared at her phone for a long, uncomfortable moment, the screen fading into black. She wasn't sure what had just happened. It could have been a prank, or maybe some wrong number. But why would they mention the children? And why had they seemed to know so much about the house? The walls suddenly felt closer, and the quiet of the house seemed too heavy, too still. Forcing her thoughts back into some semblance of order, Emma slipped her phone back into her pocket and glanced at the staircase. The children's room was upstairs, at the end of a long hallway. She hadn't heard a peep from them since she tucked them in, but now she couldn't shake the feeling that something was off. She took a deep breath and tried to shake off the rising dread. It was nothing. It had to be nothing. But as she moved toward the staircase, her feet suddenly felt like they were dragging, each step heavier than the last. The stairs creaked under her weight as she ascended, the familiar sound somehow magnified in the silence. She reached the top of the stairs and glanced toward the 2 bedrooms, the children's room at the end of the hall, the guest room across the way, and the bathroom in between. A faint light slipped under the door of the kids' room, and she felt a momentary wave of relief. The door was shut tight, but that didn't seem like a problem. They were sleeping just as she had left them. But as she moved closer, that creeping sense of unease returned, stronger this time. Something felt wrong. The house wasn't just quiet, it was waiting. Every floorboard beneath her feet seemed to whisper secrets she wasn't meant to hear. And then, as she stood outside the children's room, she heard something. It was soft at first, just a shuffling sound, a rustle of fabric. But then it grew louder, more distinct. A small thud. The sound of something being moved. Her breath caught in her throat. She didn't want to open the door. She wanted to go back downstairs, pretend she hadn't heard anything, and just wait for the parents to come back. But the feeling of the house, of the space around her, seemed to push her forward. She had to check on the kids. With a hesitant hand, she reached for the doorknob. The cold metal felt like ice against her skin. Slowly she turned it. The door creaked open. The room was dimly lit by a nightlight in the corner, casting long shadows across the walls. The children's bed was just visible in the far corner, covered in colorful blankets. But when she looked at the bed, her stomach dropped. Both children were standing there, motionless. At first, Emma thought she was seeing things. Maybe it was the dim light, or maybe she was just tired. But no. They were standing perfectly still, their faces turned toward the corner of the room. It wasn't a normal sleep posture. They weren't in bed. They weren't even moving. They were just staring. Her pulse quickened. "Hey," she whispered, her voice trembling. "What are you two doing? Come on, get back to bed." But they didn't respond. They just stood there. The silence was suffocating. She took a hesitant step forward. "Hey," she said again, a little louder this time, but the children remained silent. They didn't even turn to acknowledge her. Her hand shot out instinctively, reaching for the closest child, a small girl with brown hair. But just as her fingers brushed the girl's shoulder, the child whispered, her voice so quiet, it was barely audible above the soft hum of the air conditioner. "He's watching us." Emma's blood ran cold. The words felt like a slap, their weight sinking into her chest. What did she mean? Before she could react, the door slammed shut behind her with a force that made her jump. Emma whipped around in shock, but the room was empty. There was no one else inside, not even the children. Only the faint flicker of the nightlight remained. The door was locked from the inside. Emma's heart hammered in her chest as she stood there, frozen in the now unnervingly quiet room. Her breath came in shallow bursts, and her hands trembled as they hovered above the doorknob. She could hear her pulse, thudding in her ears, louder than the soft hum of the lights above. The children's bed, empty. The corner they had been staring at was just shadows and faint moonlight filtering through the drawn curtains. But the thing that unsettled her the most wasn't the empty bed or the locked door. It was the whisper. That quiet, chilling phrase. "He's watching us." Emma could still feel the weight of it hanging in the air, thick and oppressive. She couldn't bring herself to move, to even blink. Something was wrong. The fear that had crept in like a slow fog earlier now flooded every inch of her being. Her hands clenched around the doorknob, cold metal biting into her skin. She twisted it again, but it wouldn't budge. The door had clicked shut on its own. No draft, no reason for it to do so. And now, despite her best efforts, it seemed locked from the inside. She stepped back, her eyes scanning the room. The soft click of the clock ticking somewhere down the hall felt like a drumbeat in the dead silence. Emma knew something was wrong, but she couldn't pinpoint what. There was no logical explanation for the children's behavior, no sense in it. Why would they just stand there, staring into the corner? And why, of all things, did they say that? Emma's fingers trembled as she pulled out her phone, desperate for something, anything, that might break the eerie stillness. She glanced at the screen, hoping to see a reassuring text from the parents. Maybe they'd be back soon, and everything would return to normal. But there was nothing. Just a blank screen, the quiet buzzing of her phone, and the steadily growing dread. She looked back at the locked door, then at the window, where the storm outside raged against the glass. She was alone in this house. Completely alone. Her mind raced, trying to make sense of the situation. She should have called the parents. She should have called someone. But then the thought hit her, what if the kids weren't the problem? What if something was watching her? Something far worse than the kids. In a panic, Emma stepped back toward the window and pulled the curtains aside, the rustling fabric too loud in the silence. She stared out at the rain, watching it pour, streaking the glass in long, twisting lines. She didn't know what she was expecting to see, Maybe the parents coming back early or a police car pulling up. But there was nothing. Only the rain. Only the night. Her reflection stared back at her from the glass, pale and wide-eyed. She was afraid. And she didn't know why. The quiet seemed to grow deeper, more suffocating. It felt as though the house was holding its breath, waiting for something to happen. But what? The thought made Emma shiver, and she turned away from the window, glancing toward the door again. The children's room seemed impossibly still. Too still. Trying to steady herself, she walked over to the door, pushing her ear against it. All she could hear was the soft creak of the old wood, the settling of the house. But there was no sound of movement from the children. No sound at all. She should check on them. She had to. But something inside of her screamed not to. Every part of her body was telling her to leave, to run, to get out of the house, but her feet wouldn't move. She took a slow step backward, her hand shaking as she grabbed the doorknob again. She twisted it gently, but the door didn't open. Then came a sound from the hallway. A soft shuffle. It was faint, almost imperceptible, but it was there. Emma's blood ran cold. She turned toward the noise, heart pounding in her throat. Her eyes darted around, searching for the source, but the hallway was empty, dimly lit by the glow of a single bulb. The kids? Had they left the room? The thought made Emma's stomach twist in knots. She knew they hadn't. She would have heard them moving. They were too quiet. It was as if they were waiting, watching. She slowly stepped out into the hallway, her breath shaky, her every step feeling like an eternity. The house seemed to grow even darker with each passing moment. The shadows clung to the walls, twisting in unnatural shapes. Emma's footfalls echoed on the old wood floor as she made her way toward the stairs. Her fingers brushed against the banister, slick with sweat. The house felt alive, as though the very walls were breathing, pulsing with some terrible energy. Her eyes flickered toward the basement door at the far end of the hall, just next to the stairs. It was closed, as it had been when she first arrived. But now, in the stillness of the moment, it seemed. The door was too still, the way it stood there, perfectly shut, as though it had been waiting for her to notice. She shook her head. That was ridiculous. Her thoughts began to spiral. She needed to focus. She needed to keep it together. She reached for the banister again, gripping it tighter this time, grounding herself in its cold, solid presence. And then the lights flickered. Emma's breath caught in her throat as the hallway plunged into darkness, then blinked back to life. The sudden darkness was suffocating, pressing in on her from all sides. For a moment, she thought she had imagined it. But when the lights flickered again, followed by a low, ominous hum, Emma realized that this was no accident. The power was going out. Or something was messing with the circuits. Either way, it wasn't good. A shiver ran down her spine. She wanted to turn back. She wanted to lock herself in the living room and wait until the parents returned. But the thought of them coming home to this, her trembling, terrified in the dark, was even worse. She had to find the kids. She had to make sure they were okay. The cold, oppressive silence seemed to close in on her as she made her way to the stairs, every step feeling like it was taking her deeper into something she couldn't quite name. The basement door loomed, just a few feet away. Emma couldn't help but glance at it again. The thought that something might be in there, something waiting, gnawed at her, but she forced herself to keep walking, to keep moving. She reached the top of the stairs, and the silence was deafening. The house seemed to close in on her, pressing her in from every direction. The wind outside had picked up, rattling the windows in their frames, but Emma could barely hear it over the pounding of her own heart. She stopped at the edge of the children's room again, her stomach twisting in knots. The door was still shut. Still locked. Still wrong. She hesitated, the chill creeping up her spine again. She knocked lightly, half expecting the kids to answer. But nothing. No sound from within. The house had never felt more suffocating. Every corner was dark and closed off, as if the space itself were conspiring to keep her trapped in its grip. Emma's breath caught as a faint sound came from within the room. A slow creak, as though something, or someone, was moving inside. And then, just as quickly, it stopped. The silence returned. Emma's breath hitched as the faint sound of movement came again from within the children's room. She pressed her ear to the door, her heart hammering in her chest, straining to hear beyond the silence that enveloped the hallway. For a moment, everything seemed impossibly still, the air thick with tension. She could feel her pulse in her throat, the noise of it deafening in her ears. Every nerve in her body screamed for her to run, to get out of the house, but her feet wouldn't move. She was paralyzed, rooted in place by a fear she couldn't shake. The hairs on the back of her neck stood up, the air around her feeling colder, heavier. The soft creak of something shifting inside the room sent a jolt of fear through her. Was it one of the kids? She wanted to call out, to ask if they were okay, but her voice caught in her throat. There was something about the stillness, the unnatural quiet, that made speaking seem wrong. As if any noise would shatter the fragile barrier between her and whatever was lurking in the room beyond. After what felt like an eternity, Emma finally summoned the courage to take a step back from the door. The sound had stopped. The room was silent again, but the air felt thick with an unspoken tension. She couldn't explain it, but the feeling in her gut told her that something was wrong. The children were no longer in their beds, and that much was undeniable. The strange behavior they displayed earlier, standing motionless in the corner, whispering that eerie phrase, lingered in her mind, haunting her. She turned around, her eyes scanning the hallway again. The basement door seemed to beckon to her, almost taunting her with its dark, unreachable mystery. She couldn't shake the feeling that it was connected to everything that was happening, though she had no idea how. Was something hiding down there? Was whatever was in the children's room somehow tied to the darkness below? The questions spiraled in her mind, too fast and too overwhelming to focus on. With a deep breath, Emma forced herself to turn back to the door. She reached for the handle once more, her fingers shaking as she gripped the cold metal. She didn't want to open it. She didn't want to see what lay behind it, but something inside of her, some primal, terrified instinct, urged her to look, to face whatever was happening head-on. Twisting the handle slowly, she inched the door open, a thin sliver of light spilling into the hallway. The air was cold against her skin, and the musty smell of the room hit her immediately. The shadows seemed to stretch unnaturally, growing darker the further they reached into the room. She could see the edges of the beds, the outlines of furniture, but there was no movement, no sound. The kids weren't in sight. Emma's breath caught in her throat. The room seemed too quiet, too empty. The walls, lined with cheerful decorations, were now only a backdrop to the overwhelming silence. Her gaze moved to the far corner, where the children had been standing earlier. The place where they had stared, unmoving. But now the corner was just a corner. Nothing was there. There was no sign of them. No sign of anything unusual. She stepped inside, cautiously, each movement careful and deliberate. She wanted to call out, to demand that the children answer her, but the words seemed stuck in her throat, heavy and unspoken. As she crossed the room, her footfalls were muffled by the thick carpet beneath her. The floor felt solid beneath her, but the space itself felt hollow, as if it had been emptied out of its warmth, its life. The children's bed was untouched, the blankets perfectly in place, not a wrinkle to disturb the neatness of the sheets. But there was something about it, something unsettling about how perfect it looked, as if the room had been frozen in time, suspended between the waking world and whatever lay beyond. A sudden noise broke the silence, a soft scrape, followed by the unmistakable sound of a breath being drawn in. Emma froze, her body rigid with fear. The sound came from the closet, barely audible, but it was enough to make her heart lurch in her chest. She didn't know what it was, but she knew that she had to check. Her eyes flickered to the closet door. It was partially open, a sliver of dark space visible through the gap. She moved toward it, each step feeling heavier than the last, as if the very air was pressing in on her. She reached the door and hesitated, her hand hovering just inches from the handle. Something wasn't right. She could feel it, an instinctual pull to turn and run. But she couldn't. She couldn't leave until she understood what was happening. With a quick, jerky motion, Emma swung the door open. There was nothing inside. The closet was empty, save for a few scattered toys and the faint smell of dust. It was as if the house had simply absorbed everything, every trace of the children, every moment of joy and life that had once existed here, leaving only the cold, empty remnants behind. Emma's eyes darted around the room again, searching for any sign of the children. The room seemed to mock her, its stillness almost palpable. She felt a wave of dizziness wash over her, the overwhelming sense that she wasn't just alone in the house, she was being watched. The lights flickered again, casting strange shadows that danced across the walls. The room seemed to shift and warp around her, as if the very space was bending and twisting. Emma's head spun as the walls seemed to close in, pressing in on her from all sides. Her breathing grew shallow, and for a moment, she felt as though she might faint. The darkness was swallowing her whole, pulling her deeper into its embrace. She staggered back, her feet tripping over the edge of the carpet. Her back hit the doorframe with a soft thud, and she gasped, struggling to catch her breath. The silence was maddening, suffocating, and the feeling that something was terribly wrong had never been more intense. She had to find the children. She had to find out what had happened to them. But the house was silent. There were no footsteps, no cries for help. Only the oppressive quiet and the echo of her own heartbeat pounding in her ears. She stood there, frozen, for what felt like an eternity, before finally summoning the courage to move. She stepped back into the hallway, her heart racing in her chest. The air felt colder now, the shadows longer, as though the house had changed in some way she couldn't understand. The walls felt tighter, as if the space was closing in around her, trapping her in its grip. She turned toward the stairs, her mind a whirlwind of confusion and terror. She had to find the children, had to make sure they were safe. But the longer she stood there, the more the dread settled in her bones. The house felt alive, its creaking floorboards and shifting shadows a constant reminder that something was watching her. Something was waiting. Her gaze flickered toward the basement door again, and a cold shiver ran down her spine. She didn't want to go down there. She didn't want to face whatever might be lurking in the dark corners of the house. But she had no choice. The kids were gone, and she needed answers. There was something down there. Something that had to explain all of this. Emma swallowed hard, her throat dry, and took the first step toward the stairs. The house seemed to hold its breath, waiting for her next move. The shadows stretched farther into the hall, and the basement door loomed larger with each step she took. The tension in the air felt unbearable as Emma slowly made her way toward the stairs. Her footsteps were nearly silent on the old wood floors, but each step seemed to echo louder in her mind, as if the house itself was amplifying her every movement. The shadows seemed to stretch toward her, reaching for her legs, whispering in soft, invisible voices. She tried to steady herself, to ignore the rising dread clawing at her chest, but it was impossible. The walls felt like they were closing in, and the house, once a simple babysitting job, now felt like a living, breathing entity, its eyes fixed squarely on her. She reached the top of the stairs, the faint hum of the light bulb overhead her only company, and glanced back down the hallway. The children's room was still shut tight, the door standing like an ominous sentinel. The silence that surrounded her was suffocating, the absence of sound almost deafening. The creaking of the house, the distant rumbling of thunder outside, it was all too much. She needed to find the kids, needed to see them, to make sure they were safe. But something was holding her back, something deep inside that warned her not to trust the house, not to trust what she couldn't see. Her mind raced, trying to make sense of the bizarre happenings, of the children standing still in the corner of the room, of the phone call that had left her shaken, of the whispers in the darkness. What did it all mean? The questions twisted and turned, each answer slipping further out of her reach as the terror inside her grew. She shook her head, trying to push the thoughts away. She had to focus. The kids were her responsibility. She had to keep it together. But as she stood there, staring down at the basement door, the sense of unease deepened. It was as though the darkness from below was calling to her, pulling her toward it. The house seemed to hold its breath, waiting for her to make the next move. The basement was just a door, a dark space in the house that she had avoided all evening. But now, it felt like the center of everything, the source of whatever was wrong with this place. The air grew colder as she stared at the door, her fingers twitching at her sides. She had to go down there. She had to confront whatever lay waiting in the shadows. With a shaky breath, Emma stepped toward the stairs, her legs heavy with hesitation. Her hand hovered over the banister, gripping it for support as she slowly descended, the stairs creaking under her weight. The deeper she went, the more the darkness seemed to thicken, wrapping itself around her like a suffocating blanket. The faintest breeze from below whispered up through the cracks in the floor, carrying with it a smell of damp earth and something wrong. Something old. Emma's heart raced faster, the pounding of blood in her ears drowning out everything else. The sense of being watched, of something lurking just out of sight, grew stronger with each step she took. When she reached the bottom, the basement door loomed before her, its dark presence swallowing the light around it. There was something strange about the door, something almost magnetic in the way it seemed to draw her closer, beckoning her. Her fingers curled around the cold metal handle, and she hesitated for a moment, her pulse quickening in her throat. The silence was so thick now, so oppressive, that she could hardly breathe. The house seemed to be waiting, holding its breath, as if it too wanted to see what would happen next. With a soft click, the door swung open, and a gust of cold air hit her face. It was a sharp, biting chill that cut through her skin, making her shiver uncontrollably. The basement steps were just visible in the faint light from above, leading down into a darkness so complete, it felt alive. Emma's eyes strained to make out any shapes, but there was nothing, just a black void, the kind of darkness that swallowed everything whole. She took a step forward, the air in the basement heavy and stale. Her breath caught in her throat as she heard it, a soft scuffling sound coming from the far corner of the basement. It was faint, but it was unmistakable. The sound of something moving in the dark. The hairs on the back of Emma's neck stood up, and every instinct in her body screamed at her to turn around and run. But she couldn't. Her feet felt glued to the floor, her body frozen in place as the scuffling grew louder, more deliberate. It sounded almost like footsteps, but too soft, too muffled to be human. And then, just as suddenly as it had started, the sound stopped. The silence that followed was thick and suffocating, wrapping itself around Emma, making her feel like she couldn't escape. The air in the basement felt wrong, like it had been undisturbed for years, like it was holding something, some secret, some danger, that was just waiting for her to discover it. She wanted to turn around, to run back up the stairs and lock herself in the living room, but she knew she couldn't. Not yet. Not when she wasn't sure what was happening. Taking a deep, shaky breath, Emma stepped into the basement, the floor creaking beneath her feet as she moved slowly down the steps. The darkness was all around her now, thick and impenetrable, and she could feel the weight of it pressing in on her, making every movement feel heavy and slow. The cold seemed to seep into her bones, filling her with an icy dread she couldn't shake. She fumbled for the light switch, her fingers brushing against the wall, but when she found it, nothing happened. The light was out. She stood there in the dark for a moment, her heart pounding so hard she thought it might burst. The air was thick with the scent of dampness and decay. There was something else, though, a lingering, metallic tang that made her stomach turn. She could almost taste it, sharp and sour, on the back of her tongue. Something had been down here for a long time. Something that shouldn't have been. The feeling of being watched returned, stronger now, like invisible eyes were tracing her every move. Her mind raced, trying to make sense of what she was feeling. She had to find the children. She had to find them and get out of this house, but the basement was drawing her in. She could feel the pull, like gravity itself was urging her deeper into the darkness. Her instincts screamed at her to leave, to run, to get out, but every part of her body felt numb, as though the fear had dulled her senses, leaving only the sense that she was in the presence of something ancient, something wrong. She moved further into the basement, the cold wrapping around her like a blanket. The scuffling noise came again, louder this time, as if something was dragging itself across the floor. Emma's breath caught in her throat as she spun around, her eyes darting through the darkness, trying to make sense of the shape she couldn't quite see. There was something there. She could feel it, the air around her crackling with energy, something dark, something old. Just as she was about to call out, a whisper broke the silence, so soft and faint that it almost seemed to come from her own mind. "Don't trust them," the voice said, its tone cold and empty. The words reverberated through her skull, echoing in the empty space of the basement. Emma's blood ran cold as she realized the voice wasn't just in her head, it was real. And it was speaking to her. Before she could react, the lights flickered. The briefest flash of light revealed something in the corner of the room. A figure, barely visible, standing in the dark. Emma's body went rigid as her mind struggled to comprehend what she was seeing. The figure was tall, almost too tall, its outline barely visible in the faint glow. Its presence was oppressive, its stillness unnerving. The fear that had been building inside her broke free, crashing over her in waves. She turned to run, but her legs were weak, unsteady. The figure in the corner seemed to grow taller, its shape becoming more distinct with every second. Her pulse raced as she stumbled backward, her breath coming in quick, shallow gasps. Something was coming. Something was waiting. And it was closer than she had ever feared. Emma's heart was pounding in her chest, a frantic rhythm that echoed in her ears as she stumbled backward, her legs shaking beneath her. The figure in the corner of the basement seemed to loom larger with every passing second, its outline now unmistakable. It wasn't a person, it couldn't be. It was something else, something unnatural. The air around it felt charged, as though the very fabric of reality had bent to its will. Emma's breath caught in her throat, a cold sweat forming on the back of her neck as she struggled to process what she was seeing. It wasn't moving, not yet. But she could feel it. She could feel its presence, the oppressive weight of it pressing in on her from all sides. The basement, which had already felt stifling and cold, now seemed to warp in response to the figure, the darkness growing deeper and thicker, like a living, breathing thing. Emma's hands trembled as she fumbled for her phone, her fingers slick with sweat, but the screen remained dark, the battery dead. She should have run. She should have turned and fled the moment the basement door had creaked open. But she hadn't. She had kept moving, compelled by something she couldn't name. And now, standing at the bottom of the stairs, facing whatever this thing was, she felt the full weight of her mistake. The figure in the corner didn't move. It stood there, unmoving, its features impossible to make out. But Emma didn't need to see its face to know that it was watching her. She could feel its eyes on her, the heavy gaze that seemed to pierce through her, stripping her bare. The air around her grew colder, colder than the basement had any right to be. The breath she exhaled turned to mist, swirling in the dim light. She tried to call out, but her voice caught in her throat, the words dying before they could escape. A low, guttural sound broke the silence, a noise that seemed to come from deep within the figure, resonating in the very bones of the house. It was almost like a growl, but not quite, more like a whisper, a hiss that curled through the air, like the sound of something moving in the dark. Emma's pulse quickened. Her body screamed at her to run, to turn and flee, but her feet felt like they were rooted to the ground, her legs locked in place as the figure slowly began to move toward her. It was slow at first, deliberate, as if it was savoring the moment, savoring the fear that was radiating from her. Emma's mind raced, trying to make sense of the horror unfolding in front of her. Was this real? Was she dreaming? Was she losing her mind? The logical part of her brain screamed that this couldn't be happening, that this was some kind of nightmare she was trapped in. But the terror in her chest, the cold sweat, the bone-deep dread that had taken root in her bones, it was real. The figure took another step forward, its shape becoming more defined in the low light. Emma could make out the outline of something like a cloak or a robe flowing around its form. But there was nothing human about it. No face, no features, just darkness. She couldn't see its eyes, but she could feel them, cold, hungry, empty. The very air seemed to crackle with a malevolent energy, as though the house itself had become a part of it. The basement, once just a room beneath the house, now felt like a trap, an inescapable pit that she had fallen into. The sound of its footsteps, slow, deliberate, echoed through the basement, reverberating off the concrete walls. Emma's heart pounded harder, faster, as she realized that she was no longer alone. It wasn't just her and the house anymore. There was something else. Something dark, something ancient, something that had been waiting in the shadows for far longer than she could comprehend. The figure was almost upon her now, and Emma's body finally responded, her instincts taking over as she turned to run. Her feet stumbled on the uneven concrete floor, her heart racing as she sprinted toward the stairs. But the moment she made for the steps, the air seemed to shift. The basement, once distant, now felt closer, the walls narrowing in on her as if the space was closing in around her. Her breath came in ragged gasps, each step feeling heavier, like the weight of the house was dragging her down. The figure was faster than she had anticipated. In one fluid movement, it was in front of her, blocking her escape. Emma skidded to a halt, her eyes wide with terror as she tried to back away, but the figure reached out with one long, gnarled hand, its fingers curling like claws. The very air seemed to freeze as she felt its touch brush against her skin, cold as ice. She gasped, a sharp, choking breath escaping her throat, and pulled back, trying to break free. But the grip tightened, stronger than anything human, and Emma felt herself being drawn in, helpless against its pull. It didn't speak, didn't make a sound, but its presence was suffocating, like the weight of centuries had settled in that one, bone-chilling touch. The shadows in the basement seemed to grow, stretching and twisting, reaching for her, consuming the light. Emma's mind screamed for her to fight, to do something, anything, to break free, but her body wouldn't obey. Her limbs were numb, her movements slow, as though the very air had thickened, making it harder to breathe. The darkness was everywhere now, swirling around her, pressing in on her from all sides. And then, just as suddenly as it had come, the figure released her. Emma stumbled backward, her breath ragged and shallow, as she tried to steady herself. But the figure was still there, watching, waiting. She wanted to scream, to call for help, but the words didn't come. There was no one. There was no escape. The basement, the house, the very ground beneath her feet felt like it was part of something much older, much darker than anything she could understand. The lights flickered again, casting eerie shadows on the walls, and Emma's gaze snapped toward the stairs. It was her only chance. She had to make it to the top, to get out of the basement, to get out of the house. But she knew it wouldn't be that easy. Whatever this thing was, whatever had been lurking in the darkness, was not going to let her leave. With one final, desperate push, Emma turned and bolted for the stairs. Her legs were weak, her body exhausted from the terror and the cold, but she didn't stop. She couldn't stop. Each step felt like a battle, the shadows reaching for her heels, the air thick with malevolent energy. She reached the stairs and grabbed the banister, pulling herself up, her breath coming in ragged, panicked gasps. She couldn't hear anything behind her, no footsteps, no movement, but she knew it was there. She could feel it. As she reached the top of the stairs, she turned, her hand shaking as she grabbed the door handle. But before she could open it, a voice whispered from the darkness below. It wasn't the figure. No, this voice was deeper, older, and more insidious. Leaving so soon, it hissed, the sound like a snake slithering through her veins. You can't escape me. Emma froze, her hand trembling on the door handle. She knew the voice wasn't human. She knew it wasn't from anyone alive. It was the voice of the house itself, the voice of the darkness that had been waiting for her. Emma's hand clutched the doorknob, her fingers trembling so violently that it was a miracle she hadn't dropped it. Her body was still locked in place, frozen at the top of the stairs, as the voice from the basement slithered through the air, a cold whisper that seemed to seep into her very bones. You can't escape me, it hissed again, its tone serpentine and thick with malice. The words wrapped around her like a vice, squeezing the breath from her chest. Her heart pounded, each beat louder than the last, each pulse of blood in her ears almost deafening. She could feel the weight of the house pressing in on her, its oppressive, suffocating presence clinging to her skin. For a moment, Emma stood there, paralyzed, caught between the urge to run and the fear that any movement would be her undoing. She couldn't leave, not like this. She couldn't leave the house, not with whatever that thing was waiting in the shadows. And yet she couldn't stay. The terror, the bone-deep dread gnawing at her, told her that whatever was down there in the basement, whatever had been watching her, would never let her go. She had to get out. She had to survive. Summoning every ounce of strength she had left, Emma wrenched the door open, the old wood creaking as it gave way. The basement door swung wide, the darkness within seeming to pulse and breathe, as though it were alive. But the air around her was still, eerily still. The basement no longer seemed like a place she could escape to. Instead, it felt like the very threshold of something far worse. She hesitated, staring down the stairs, her body screaming for her to run. But it wasn't just fear that held her back. It was a strange compulsion, something deep within her mind that told her she needed to confront whatever waited in the darkness. The house was no longer just a place, it was a puzzle she needed to solve. She couldn't leave without understanding what was happening here, without knowing what she was up against. Her breath was shallow, her chest tight as she took the first step, then the second. Each movement felt like it took an eternity, her legs like lead as she descended further into the gloom. The silence was unbearable, punctuated only by the sound of her own breath and the soft thud of her footsteps on the stairs. The air down here felt different, thicker, colder, like the very atmosphere was charged with something malevolent. The hairs on the back of her neck stood on end as she stepped into the basement, and the darkness seemed to swallow her whole. The flickering light bulb overhead cast faint shadows that shifted like ghosts on the walls. Emma moved cautiously, her eyes darting around the room, trying to pierce the blackness that seemed to move just beyond the reach of the light. Her senses were heightened, every creak of the floorboards beneath her feet, every subtle shift in the air, sending a fresh wave of terror through her. She had never been this scared in her life. And yet, there was something else. A strange, twisted curiosity that gnawed at her, urging her to go deeper. Her hand reached out, brushing against the wall, cold and damp with age. It was then that she noticed it, the faintest scratch marks along the floor, as if something had been dragged across the stone, something heavy, something with purpose. The marks led toward the far corner of the basement, where the shadows seemed to grow darker, thicker. Her pulse quickened. She wasn't alone. She wasn't alone at all. The scuffling sound came again, soft at first, like the shuffle of bare feet on concrete. Emma's breath caught in her throat as she whipped around, her eyes searching the dim space for the source of the sound. Her skin prickled with the sensation of being watched, every instinct telling her that something was coming for her. The hair on the back of her neck stood up, and for a moment, she felt as though the very air around her was charged with static. And then, from the corner of the basement, it emerged. The figure was different now. It wasn't just a shadow, a vague outline in the dark. It had shape, form, and movement. It was tall, too tall, and its limbs stretched unnaturally, as if they were far longer than they should have been. The cloak or robe it wore billowed around its frame like smoke, dark and shifting as though it wasn't even solid, just a collection of shadows woven together. The air grew colder as it stepped forward, its presence pulling the warmth from the room. Emma's breath froze in her chest as the figure moved toward her. Her body screamed to run, to flee, but she couldn't. The terror had paralyzed her. She stood there, her body rigid, her feet rooted to the ground, as the figure drew closer. Its face remained hidden, obscured by the darkness, but Emma could feel its gaze. It was watching her, studying her, as though it were waiting for something. The silence in the basement deepened, growing suffocating, the weight of it pressing in on her from all sides. Emma's chest tightened, her breath coming in shallow gasps. She tried to speak, to ask what it wanted, but her voice failed her, the words caught in her throat. The figure took another step toward her, and then another, its form bending and shifting with an unnatural fluidity. It stopped just in front of her, so close now that Emma could feel the cold emanating from it, wrapping around her like a suffocating blanket. She was trembling uncontrollably, her hands pressed against her sides, her legs shaking as though they would give way beneath her at any moment. The figure didn't speak. It didn't need to. Its very presence was enough to fill her mind with 1,000 unspoken threats. It was as if it was waiting for her to understand, to grasp the true horror of the situation. And then it reached out. Emma barely had time to react as one long, twisted hand shot out toward her, its fingers curling like claws. The touch was like ice, freezing her where she stood. She gasped, but no sound came out. The cold seeped into her skin, into her bones, as though the very touch of the thing was draining her warmth, draining her life. She could feel the chill spreading through her, numbing her senses, dulling her thoughts. The figure's face was still hidden, but Emma could sense its presence more clearly now, its power. It was older than anything she had ever known. This wasn't just a ghost or some apparition, it was something much darker, something that had been waiting for years, centuries, maybe even longer. The house was just a vessel, a prison for whatever had been trapped here. She tried to pull away, but the grip was too strong, too cold. Her body was already growing numb, her limbs too heavy to move. She had to get away. She had to break free, but the darkness was closing in on her, suffocating her, pulling her down into it. The figure moved closer, its presence overwhelming, and Emma's vision blurred. Just when she thought she couldn't take it anymore, when the cold had almost consumed her completely, the figure paused. Its fingers lingered just above her skin, the chill still radiating, but there was no further movement. Emma didn't understand. Why had it stopped? What was it waiting for? The questions spun in her mind, but there was no answer. The basement felt like it was holding its breath, and Emma was trapped in the stillness, caught in the unrelenting grip of whatever this thing was. The darkness seemed to press in on her, suffocating her, until the only thing left was the cold, the silence, and the terrible feeling that she was no longer alone. She was a part of it now. And whatever had been waiting in the shadows was finally revealing itself. Emma's mind raced, her thoughts chaotic and scattered as the cold, suffocating grip of the figure tightened around her. The darkness seemed to stretch on forever, consuming everything in its path. Her body felt like stone, immovable, her limbs frozen under the chilling touch of the entity. Each breath she managed to take was shallow, her lungs aching with the effort to draw in air. The cold seemed to be crawling under her skin, threading through her veins like ice, numbing her from the inside out. She wanted to scream, to cry out, but no sound emerged. Her throat was tight, choked with fear, as though her very voice had been stolen. The figure before her was silent now, its form towering above her, and for the first time, Emma realized that she wasn't just standing in the basement. She was standing in a space beyond it, a place where the boundaries of the house no longer seemed to matter. The air around her was thick with something ancient, something beyond comprehension. It wasn't just the figure that terrified her now. It was the oppressive weight of the house itself, the sense that it was alive, that it had been waiting for her, drawing her in with the slow inevitability of a trap. Her mind screamed for her to wake up, to find some way to escape, but her body betrayed her, locked in place, her legs too weak to carry her away. The figure's hand remained suspended in the air, just above her skin, the cold still radiating from its fingers. For a moment, it seemed to hesitate, as if considering something. And then, in a movement so fluid it defied logic, it lowered its hand, reaching out toward her chest. Emma gasped, her eyes widening with terror as the entity's fingers brushed against her. The touch was unbearable, like fire and ice combined. It burned and froze all at once, an unbearable agony that sent shockwaves through her body, radiating outward from the point of contact. But instead of pushing her back, the figure's touch seemed to pull her closer, drawing her in with an unyielding force. She could feel her body being dragged toward it, the darkness swirling around her, thickening like a storm. The whispers grew louder now, distant and unintelligible, like the sound of 1,000 voices all speaking at once. Emma could barely focus on them, her mind clouded by the pain, the cold, the confusion. She wanted to break free, to get away from this thing, this entity that had somehow trapped her in its grip. But it was too strong. She was too weak. Her arms hung limply at her sides, and she felt the weight of the house, of the darkness, bearing down on her. Then, just as suddenly as it had begun, the figure released her. Emma stumbled backward, gasping for air, the world around her spinning as she struggled to regain her balance. The cold receded, but the numbness remained, creeping into her bones, making it difficult to move. Her breath came in ragged, panicked gasps, and her heart thudded painfully against her ribcage. She looked up, but the figure was gone. The basement had returned to its unnatural stillness, the only sound her own labored breathing. But Emma knew it wasn't over. The house was still alive, still watching her, and whatever that thing was, whatever force had been haunting her, was not finished with her. The shadows in the corners of the basement seemed to writhe, as though they had a life of their own. The walls appeared to close in, the space around her growing smaller, suffocating, until Emma could hardly breathe. She felt as though she were standing on the edge of something vast, something ancient and unknowable. And yet, she couldn't leave. She couldn't move. The house had a grip on her now, and it wasn't letting go. Her eyes darted to the stairs, to the door she had left behind, but the way out seemed so far away, almost unreachable. The path that had once seemed so simple, so easy, now felt like a maze, like a journey she might never complete. The house, with its endless darkness, was closing in on her, and there was no escape. And then, a low sound cut through the air, a whisper, faint at first, but growing louder, more insistent. Emma turned toward it, her body trembling in response. The sound was coming from the farthest corner of the basement, from the place where the shadows were the darkest. The whisper seemed to be calling her, pulling her toward it. "Come closer," the voice hissed, its tone so cold it sent a shiver down her spine. "You have to see." Emma's instincts screamed at her to run, to get as far away from the voice as possible. But her body wouldn't obey. It wasn't fear that held her now, but a strange compulsion. The voice wasn't just speaking to her. It was inside her, beneath her skin, vibrating in her very bones. It wasn't just a sound, it was a command. She needed to follow it. She needed to understand. Her feet moved before she could stop them, dragging her through the darkness, closer and closer to the source of the voice. The shadows parted in front of her as if making way, but they didn't feel like shadows anymore. They felt alive, like they were watching her, crawling across the walls, reaching toward her. The air was thick with dread, but Emma couldn't stop. She had to see. She had to know. As she neared the corner of the basement, the temperature dropped even further, and the walls seemed to close in, pushing her forward. Her heartbeat was loud in her ears now, thumping with each step. Every part of her wanted to run, to get out of this cursed place, but the pull of the voice was irresistible. The darkness was swallowing her whole, but she had no choice but to keep moving. And then, as she rounded the corner, she saw it. There was something there, something in the farthest, darkest part of the basement. It was just a shape at first, a shadow among shadows, but as she stepped closer, it took form. The air grew colder still, and Emma could feel the weight of its presence, the deep, crushing pressure that seemed to come from the very walls themselves. The figure before her was not human. It was something else, something ancient and unknowable. It was almost humanoid, its form stretched and distorted, as if its shape had been warped by the darkness that clung to it. Its eyes, or what should have been eyes, glowed faintly in the darkness, a dull, unnatural light that flickered like a dying flame. The figure stood motionless, as though waiting for her, its presence suffocating the space around it. The whispers grew louder, and Emma felt the pull intensify. She couldn't look away. She couldn't stop herself from taking one step closer, then another. Her chest tightened with fear, but the compulsion to move forward was stronger. "Look at me," the voice rasped, its tone almost pleading. "See what I've been waiting for." Emma felt her mind slip, her thoughts scattered like leaves in the wind. She was no longer sure what was real and what wasn't. She could feel the house, feel it pulsing with the dark energy that had consumed everything. She could feel herself slipping, falling into the depths of something terrible and unknown. And then, just as she was about to reach out, the figure moved. It was so fast, so sudden, that Emma barely had time to react before it was upon her. The air grew thick with its presence, and she felt a rush of cold so intense it burned, burning through her skin, through her flesh, into her very soul. She cried out, but no sound escaped her lips. Her body froze, unable to move, unable to scream. The figure was too close now, its form shifting, warping, becoming something even darker, more twisted, more monstrous. And then it spoke again, its voice not a whisper, but a roar, echoing through her skull, shaking the very foundation of the house. "You are mine," it bellowed. "You have always been mine." In that moment, Emma knew she was trapped. She was never meant to leave. And there was no escape from the horrors that had waited in the darkness. The figure towered over her, its presence overwhelming in the claustrophobic space of the basement. Emma could feel its coldness crawling beneath her skin, spreading through her veins, freezing her from the inside out. Every breath she took felt like it was pulled from her lungs by invisible hands. Her legs shook violently, and she could no longer tell if the tremors were from fear or from the icy grip of the entity surrounding her. It loomed in front of her, its distorted shape shifting and writhing in the dim light, like it was made of smoke and shadow. Its eyes, if they could even be called eyes, burned with an unnatural, sickly glow, as if they were not made of organic material but something far darker, far more malevolent. Emma tried to move, to fight, but her body wouldn't respond. She felt as though she was trapped in some kind of terrible, waking nightmare. She couldn't escape, couldn't even scream. The words the entity had spoken echoed in her mind, a relentless mantra that seemed to pierce through the fog of terror clouding her thoughts. You are mine. She wanted to understand, to make sense of what was happening, but her mind was spinning in a dizzying whirl of confusion and panic. She had come here to take care of the children, to fulfill her job, to leave at the end of the night. But now, standing face to face with this creature, she realized that nothing had ever been what it seemed. The house, the children, even the phone call earlier, everything was part of something much bigger, something ancient and terrifying that she couldn't begin to comprehend. The figure in front of her moved then, its long limbs shifting with unnatural fluidity, drawing nearer, its grotesque form seeming to stretch and distort the air around it. It spoke again, its voice not from its mouth but from somewhere deeper, like a voice coming from the very walls of the house, from the earth itself. You were chosen, it rasped, its voice dripping with malice. This house, this place, it is your prison now. And I am its keeper. Emma's heart thudded painfully in her chest as her mind reeled. Chosen? What did that mean? What had she done to deserve this? She hadn't asked for any of this. She hadn't even believed in the stories about haunted houses or paranormal activity. She had only taken the babysitting job because she needed the money, because it was an easy way to pass the time. And yet, here she was, standing in the middle of a nightmare, facing an entity that seemed to exist outside of time and reason. The air grew heavier, the oppressive darkness closing in around her. She could feel the walls of the basement narrowing, the very fabric of reality seeming to stretch and warp under the weight of the entity's presence. Her head swam, and she felt her legs threaten to give out beneath her. Her body was no longer her own. It felt as though the very house was controlling her, manipulating her, bending her to its will. A sudden, sharp pain shot through her chest, and she gasped, clutching at her ribcage. The pain was excruciating, like something was inside her, tearing through her from the inside out. She staggered backward, but the figure moved with her, its long, spectral limbs gliding through the air with terrifying ease. The shadows in the room twisted, coiling around her, pulling her back toward the center of the room, toward the entity. The pain in her chest intensified, and she cried out, her vision blurring as tears filled her eyes. She didn't know what was happening. She didn't know why she was feeling this way. Struggle all you want, the figure murmured, its voice so cold, so final. You cannot escape your fate. This house belongs to me, and now, so do you. The words hit her like a slap, sharp and jarring, but the reality of them began to sink in slowly, like a cold, heavy weight settling in her gut. This wasn't just about her. It wasn't just about the children she had been hired to watch. It was about something much older, something far more dangerous. This house, this place, had been waiting for someone. And she was that someone. The figure stepped forward, its long fingers reaching out toward her again. She felt an overwhelming urge to recoil, to run, but her feet wouldn't move. She was paralyzed, trapped, caught in its gaze, caught in the pull of whatever dark force had taken hold of the house. The basement seemed to close in on her, the walls pressing in, the shadows writhing and twisting like living things. A distant, high-pitched sound broke through the thick air, a faint ringing in her ears. It took her a moment to realize what it was, her phone, still lying on the floor at the foot of the stairs. It had been silent for hours, but now, in the thick of her terror, it began to ring. The sound was maddening in its sharpness, a jarring contrast to the suffocating silence that had filled the house for so long. The figure didn't seem to notice the phone, or if it did, it didn't care. But Emma's mind latched onto it, desperate for something, anything, that could pull her out of this nightmare. With every ounce of strength she could muster, Emma took a step toward the stairs. Her legs felt like lead, her body still weighed down by the entity's presence, but she pushed forward. The ringing of the phone was louder now, almost deafening, but it fueled her. It was the only thing that seemed real in this nightmare. She could feel the pull of the shadows at her back, feel the darkness trying to drag her down, but she fought it, dragging herself toward the phone. Her hand reached out, trembling as she snatched the device from the floor. Without thinking, she pressed it to her ear, her breath coming in desperate gasps, her heart pounding in her chest. "Hello," she managed to croak, her voice barely audible, trembling with fear. There was a long pause on the other end of the line. Then the voice that responded was calm, too familiar. It was the same voice that had called her hours ago, the voice that had sounded so strange, so wrong. "Emma, you shouldn't have come here," the voice said softly, almost pityingly. "You've already crossed the threshold. There's no way out now." The words hit her like a physical blow, and her grip on the phone faltered. The coldness that had been creeping up her spine turned to ice, and the shadows seemed to shift, as if the walls themselves were alive, closing in on her. The phone slipped from her hand and fell to the ground with a dull thud, but she barely noticed it. Her mind was reeling. "You were never meant to leave," the voice continued, its tone almost sad, almost mournful. "This house belongs to something ancient, something powerful. It has been waiting for you, waiting for this moment. And now it has you." Emma's breath hitched, her throat tightening. It wasn't a prank. It wasn't a mistake. The voice on the other end had known. It had known exactly what was happening. It had known she was coming. The horror of it all crashed over her like a wave, and she felt her knees buckle beneath her. She collapsed to the floor, her vision swimming as the room spun around her. The figure was closer now, looming over her, its shadow casting a dark pall over everything. It spoke again, its voice a low, guttural growl that reverberated through the very walls of the house. "You belong to me now, Emma," it whispered, its breath cold and foul against her skin. "You always have." The air grew colder still, and Emma felt the chill seep deeper into her soul. The house was no longer just a house. It was a prison. And she was its prisoner. Trapped forever.